Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Sunday Wire. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We're streaming out live on the Alternate Current Radio Network and also at 21stCenturyWire.com. Our next guest is joining us on the live link from halfway across the world. Her name is Maram Susli, otherwise known as Syrian Girl, but also Partisan Girl on Twitter. And she's joining us right now. Hello, Maram.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's nice to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. And there's a lot going on right now in the Middle East, of course, in Syria. And Donald Trump as well has inserted himself in the early hours of this morning. A gallant raid, we're told, to kill the leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. We'll talk about that as well. But the big news that I wanted to talk to you about was it was a big announcement that the U.S. were withdrawing their troops from Syria, and this was huge controversy politically in America. There was arguments back and forth between the neocons and the White House and the Democrats and the Republicans, and between the Turks, the Russians, Damascus, the U.S. And I'm wondering, looking at recent reports, Maram, did the U.S. actually withdraw its troops and assets from northern Syria?
Well, no. As Trump said, they are still in the oil fields, and they in fact brought in reinforcements for, to bring people into the oil fields. And apparently, last I've heard, they're actually moving back into some of the bases that they abandoned in the north of the country. So it's almost like they're trying to reverse some of Trump's decision to pull out.
Do you think that was a move or a kind of a public relations move by the White House to kind of ameliorate the situation, the tense situation a couple weeks ago, and it's been kind of overtaken now by back to U.S. long-term policy and goals with regards to, let's say, not letting Syria get a hold of its own natural resources, maybe?
Well, that was always the goal at the end of the day. Like the entire let's support the Kurds, get an autonomous region was really about denying the rest of Syria's population access to its own oil resources, as well as legitimizing the occupation. So that is always been the plan. I think that the fact that, Trump was saying we have to end these perpetual wars, but we're going to stay in the oil fields, it's complete, schizophrenic contradiction. So that stuff that he said about ending the wars, it's just been thrown out the window, and that's just created an opportunity for the neocons to move back into some regions of the north and perhaps try to stop or block the Russian Syrian military advance and be spoilers for the Russia-Turkish deal.
Okay, so just to explain to people who aren't familiar, when the U.S. said it was pulling out a couple weeks ago, Mike Pence made a big dramatic announcement there over in Turkey. He said, we've cut a deal with Erdogan, and this is going to be like a ceasefire or a pause. It's going to be for like 5 days, and it's going to save the lives of so many Kurdish residents and fighters that would have died by a Turkish invasion or incursion. And then the media kind of backed off at that point, and they said, there was complaints, but the Americans believed, there's, the bloodshed is going to be solved. And then all of a sudden that 5-day period expired. Then what happened after that? Where is the U.S. at that point?
Well, as far as Trump is concerned, as soon as those 5 days were up, this Turkish and Russian and Syria kind of stayed out of it. But they made a deal whereby the Syrian military would take those territories that was meant to be the buffer zone instead of Turkey. And of course, the Syrian military had already made a deal with the SDF that they would take the Kurdish SDF, that they would take those territories. So it was kind of out of the United States' hands at that point. And the only thing that they now had influence over was their deal with Erdogan, in that they remain near the oil fields. And the only thing that was left to do for Trump was to say, at least the the Russians and the Syrians will make sure that the Kurds will stay safe. And that's been their position because there's nothing else they can do. They certainly can't defend the Kurds against Turkey because Turkey is their NATO ally. They can't fire at it, unlike the Syrian military.
Mm-hmm. So where a lot of people are confused as where Turkey stands in all this, because Turkey's saying that they want to establish this safe zone. And by the way, it's very similar to the safe zone proposals of Hillary Clinton and John Kerry and so many others in the last few years of the last administration. And so, but he's using the Free Syrian Army, which is a proxy force, opposition force that the U.S. funded and equipped and armed. And it's using them as Erdogan's shock troops that he's sending into Syria. Turkish regulars are a little bit further back or on the artillery lines, but not on the front lines. They're actually using Free Syrian Army, or you could say Al-Qaeda affiliates in a way. And they're doing the fighting on the ground and fighting the Kurds, so to speak. And so,
yeah, indeed,
go ahead.
It's the U.S. that armed the FSA, which is affiliated to Al-Qaeda, which is now attacking the Kurds. They armed the people attacking the Kurds. They're also the reason why Turkey is attacking the Kurds at all, because they armed the YPG, the PKK, which the Turks and the Americans see as terrorist organizations. That's what they have them listed as. So in empowering these separatist movements, they've kind of been the reason why the Turks have, targeted them inside Syria. If they hadn't had done that, then if they hadn't had started the war, none of this would have happened. So it's ironic that the neocons are trying to say that the U.S. has to save the Kurds when it's entirely their policies that have created a situation by which, they're being attacked.
And do you think Turkey has any other agenda items besides like pushing back the PKK or the YPG terrorists as they're referred to and as they're considered by the Turkish government? Does Turkey have any other aspirations in Syria in terms of changing the demographics in that region or changing the border even? What do you think about that?
It's a very important question. I think it's very clear to me that the most important thing that they have is the fear of the separatist movement of the PKK rising up in Turkey. And if they were to have an autonomous region in Syria, they would threaten Turkey for that reason. Of course, I also think that secondary to that, that's why I see that as the most important thing, is they're willing to lose an alliance with the US and leave Turkey over that point. But the secondary objective, of course, is to gain a foothold of influence inside Syria, because they're also funding the FSA and Al-Qaeda affiliated groups in Idlib. And this is about trying to get some kind of political sway in Syria's future. Lastly, they continuously claim this is not about stealing Syrian land. There is a piece of Syria that Turkey took called Iskenderun, which they renamed Hatay. And even though Syrians still live there, they annexed that piece of land. So it's not something that hasn't happened before. And the threat of that exists. But now we're in a climate where the United Nations does protect to some weak degree the sovereignty of nations, and so that's a lot more far-fetched. It's more likely they will use the territory that they control as a bargaining chip in future negotiations. What you say about demographics, they want to change the demographics of the region. The thing is that the demographics of the region was already changed by the Kurdish militias, who have been on record, even amongst the US-backed humanitarian groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, to have ethnically cleansed Arabs and Assyrian Christians. I mean, they've been on record as having burnt Arab villages. They would threaten, Arabs to leave their homes lest they call in U.S. airstrikes and claim it's Al-Qaeda. They created a law where they would, if somebody leaves their home, then they can confiscate that home, and Kurds can therefore live in it instead. So there was already these demographic changes happening in the east, and a lot of the refugees in Turkey are actually already from the northeast of Syria. So I do kind of reject that claim that, they want to Arabize what is Kurdish territory, because there were already, Kurds were never really a majority in the northeast of Syria. Arabs and Assyrians were also very significant minorities in that area. So it wasn't just for Kurds alone. And Syria is for all Syrians, whatever their ethnicity. If you're Syrian, it shouldn't matter which part of the country you live in. But of course, for Turkey, the reason why they're doing it is because they want to reverse the demographic gains that the Kurdish militias have made.
And you hear this a lot if you watch CNN or you Washington Post or any of the Western media outlets, BBC, and whenever they're in the refugee camps in Turkey, especially in the last few weeks, because this has been a bigger issue now, they're wanting to resettle, the plan to resettle them. Turkey's saying we want to put them in a safe zone. And they characterize all Syrians pretty much in Turkish refugee camps as fleeing the regime. So these are Syrians who have fled the regime, and they need to go to a, quote, safe zone in order to be safe. So that's kind of how the Western media, as far as I know, is constructed the narrative on that. And so
as far as I could see, the Western media was, but I didn't see that. In fact, as far as I could tell, the Western media constructed the movement of refugees back into Syria as a genocide against Kurds. That's how I saw it constructed, like refugees going back to their country is a genocide now. But it's which is ridiculous. But I think that there is a danger here in exactly what you're saying, the idea that the safe zone for refugees, where are they going to live? How long is the safe zone going to be for? Does this mean that the Turks have this long vision of a perpetual occupation where they're going to build houses for these people and keep them safe? I mean, is this their version of the Kurds need an autonomous region, the same way the US is using the Kurds? So there is the danger of that, but I think that the danger coming from Turkey is much easier to face than the danger coming from a country as powerful as the United States.
Yes. And here's Erdogan actually gave a speech at Fenerbahce. It's a Turkish football club. He's an aspiring professional footballer, by the way. He actually wanted to do that rather than be in politics. But unfortunately, he wasn't that great of a striker. But yesterday, what he said, if they don't support our projects for the return of refugees to Syria, then we will have no other option left but to open our borders. We will open the doors and they will depart to Europe. This is not blackmail, says President Erdogan. So he's saying this is not blackmail, but actually it kind of does sound like blackmail. It's not the first time he's done that with the European Union. The first time, I think he managed to also secure quite a lot of funds from the EU to manage the refugee problem. So do you think there's a financial incentive at play as well with Turkey? I know they're playing a few different angles here on this, but
I think the financial element would be the least of their worries at the moment. I think that they didn't, which I find it strange. I always thought that by going along with NATO in destabilizing Syria, it's very obvious this is going to go back and bite them. Like they're shooting themselves in the foot. But they probably didn't sign up for having millions of refugees on their border for 10 years. They didn't sign up for, the U.S. backing the PKK and possibly creating an autonomous region in Syria. Those weren't on the list of things that they were okay with. So in doing that, I guess this is Erdogan's revenge against Europe for backing the US's Kurdistan push and using the refugees as a threat. Like, if you don't want them back in Syria, well, you can take them because I'm not going to keep them. That's what he's trying to do.
Just lastly on the refugees, if they're refugees from Syria, they must be coming from somewhere in Syria. So could they not go back to their hometowns, or aside from Idlib, which is unstable? Unless all of these refugees from Idlib, or they must be from other parts of Syria? Could they possibly return, or are there many of them from East Aleppo, for instance, where there's not a lot of homes, but people are still returning there as well and rebuilding? So what have you heard about?
I think a lot of them are from Raqqa. So if they're from if the refugee camp is the one in Iskenderun, or as they call it, Hatay province now, then yeah, they would be from Idlib or even Damascus. The people who refused to give up their arms were put on buses and sent to Idlib. So there's those group of people, but more so near that border, I imagine that's what the Turks are talking about. The millions of people near the east side of the country on the Turkish side of the border. A lot of them are from Raqqa. Some of them are even Kurdish. So yeah, they would, if they go back, they would probably find that their houses are destroyed if it was Raqqa that they come from.
Yeah, because that's also an interesting question as well. Where can they go back to their home cities or towns or villages if not? And
Ain al-Arab and Manbij also destroyed.
And so right now the U.S. Repositioned some of its troops over into Iraq, and the Iraqi defense minister came out this week and said, you've got 4 weeks, and you guys you're not welcome here, basically. We don't want to see a buildup of U.S. forces again in these areas. So it seemed like the U.S. is kind of hedging its bets, maybe keeping some of its assets, positions, and so it can go back into Syria if, let's say, ISIS is to reemerge miraculously in some part of northeastern Syria. And it looks like it's already going in that direction. Iraq also has protests going on, and there's kind of uprisings as well. There's been a lot of accusations that some of this has been steered by foreign powers, let's say. I guess that's always going to be a risk. But how do you see the relationship between Iraq and Syria? Because it hasn't always been great historically over the last couple of decades, but it seems like it's not as bad as it now than it was in the past. How do you see this coming together or how important is it between this relationship between Iraq and Syria right now?
There was a Ba'athist split for a while that caused a rift, but since even while Saddam was still around, a lot of that rift was mended. I see that the protests in Iraq, while there is absolutely always legitimate grievances that these people have, the timing of it was when Syria and Iraq opened their border crossing. And they are targeting Iran and the media, in Lebanon, for example, as well. Like, it all started as an not sectarian, anti-corruption, anti-banks taking loans protest. And the media is pushing to make it about Hezbollah, to make it about Iran, which is nonsensical because they're hardly in the government in order to be any part of the corruption. But that's what the media wants because of, Rupert Murdoch and the Zionist lobby. And so I think that it has to do with what's happening in Syria a lot, and it has to do with trying to push out the Iranian influence and the resistance, break up the resistance axis.
Yes, I think it was interesting. I think it was yourself or Tim Anderson, Dr. Tim Anderson, tweeted out. It was a screenshot from, I think it was a Washington Post op-ed saying we lost Syria, let's not lose Lebanon, is talking from a Western perspective. Like we failed in Syria, I guess, to achieve regime change, and let's not fail in Lebanon. I don't know if you saw that piece.
Yes, I did, and I tweeted it. Indeed,
there was you. Okay, I mean, that's quite a brazen headline there by the Washington Post. I mean, it's quite unbelievable to read that. What are your thoughts on that?
If you read it closely, what he said was a lot of people in Washington see the protests as a way to like see that we can turn the protests against Hezbollah. However, like we have a lot of our own puppets in Lebanon that are currently at risk, including the central bank and Jumblat. And the problem is that they're corrupt, but the solution is to pour more money in. So that's interesting that he's like completely he didn't deny that Washington sees this as an opportunity to cause some problems and defeat the resistance in Lebanon, but at the same time he's worried about the puppets that might be like wiped out in that wave. The corrupt politicians that the Saudi Arabia and the U.S. back.
Yeah, so is that all the U.S. can do in this situation? Is decide where to throw its money? Because I don't think they can do much militarily in Lebanon. Not really.
Well, the risk is a civil war again if they try to. Since they're singling out. Now, at the beginning, it was the Shiites were, of course, joining the protests, but there's been a drive to try to push them out of the protests. And if it keeps going in that direction, then it could turn into another, like, the same civil war scenario repeated. So that's the danger. And then what would happen after that is Israeli occupation.
And that's something that people aren't really, they're not wanting to talk about, I think, with Lebanon, and there's this demonization of Hezbollah that's kind of constant coming from the U.S. from the Western side, but they don't like to talk about the history of what's happened recently in Lebanon between Israel and Lebanon, or what Hezbollah did to push Israel out of South Lebanon in not so long ago. And I think that's
to push Al-Qaeda out of Syria as well.
Yeah, and also they managed to push together with the Lebanese army and the Syrian army and Hezbollah managed to push some ISIS cells out of North Lebanon as well. I think in the mountain border range, they successfully worked together to push Al-Qaeda and ISIS, or ISIS-related cells, I guess you could say, out of there. So there has been a lot of success in terms of working together, but I guess the danger is, Maram, when there's no war, then the political infighting or other things fill the vacuum, and that's the difficult part. I guess when it's an emergency and everyone jumps on board to help, it's good, and then when it's done, then other corruption issues start coming up, and outside powers could come in to maybe divide factions. I think that's a big risk. And so how about the U.S. in terms of Syria? They've really expanded their embassy in Lebanon. And a lot of people were saying, when I was there recently, that's where they're going to do the reconstruction of Syria. That's where the U.S. is going to be, masterminding the rebuilding of Syria from this base of operations in Lebanon. But I do you really see that happening? Is there any chance of that?
I don't think that the U.S. wants Syria to rebuild. I mean, not unless it's in their vision, which would be like, I guess just the oil fields being rebuilt. That's what Trump wants right now, just to, upgrade the oil fields, but and have control over them. But, while Assad is in power, they absolutely don't want any kind of rebuilding. And look at Iraq. It's been how many years since 2003? How much rebuilding has happened there? I don't think it's in their interests for Syria to rebuild. That's why they're denying Syria their, access to oil and revenue and resources to slow down rebuilding, because they would rather Syria be weakened perpetually for the sake of Israel. But even if they wanted to get the rebuilding contracts to make money, Syria is certainly not going to give it to them. And so it's just a pipe dream.
And how about the Gulf states? I mean, considering the role that, like, for instance, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the amount of money they plowed into the various rebel groups and paid for U.S. arms trafficking, that's admitted and on record from the U.S. side, procuring weapons, and the Saudis were paying the bill, or the Qataris were paying the bill. And so would Syria then, is it possible that the government in Damascus might say, okay, right, it's over, and if the Gulf states want to be partners again, if you want to have good relations, we'll hit the reset button, and then Gulf money would come in for rebuilding projects? Is any of that possible, or is the kind of bad blood, does it go really deep? How? I
think that the Gulf states, interestingly, tried to invite Damascus back into the Arab League not too long, about a year ago, I think. And Damascus had a very cool reception to that. Like, they didn't agree or disagree. But then very quickly, the United States influenced the Arabs to reverse that invitation precisely because they don't want them to help rebuild Syria or make Syria, back into its own old state. And at this point, the question has to be asked: how much has Syria gained from the Arab League or the Arab influence? If anything, it's been damaging to Syria, and so there really has to be something in it for Syria to accept these states back into the sphere of influence. At the same time, they can't, because the U.S. has so much control over them that they can't even open an invitation for Syria to come back to the Arab League.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of people don't think that the Arab League is just the most impotent of multilateral organizations that there ever was. In other words, they can't affect really any, let's say, decision-making, regional or conflict resolution, or all the kind of important things that you'd expect a group like that to do, but they're not actually able to do. So maybe it would be prudent to not rejoin the Arab League, because, and also the U.S. tends to wield a lot of influence in there through its Gulf partners, maybe too much influence. And I remember the Friends of Syria tour that Hillary Clinton and William Hague was fronting, if you remember, back in 2011, 2012. They were also using the Arab League as a kind of a launching pad for making all of those sort of relationships and connections back then. And so, but do you see, how do you see the Middle East, right? Do you see two Middle Easts, or do you see, democratic, secular, Arab nationalist countries, and then you have Gulf monarchies on the other side? Is it possible for any kind of political or regional collective union or security pacts or political consensus building, or is it just going to be divided between Arab nationalist or Arab democracies and monarchies?
I think it's not in our interest to be divided for a long time. However, I also think that there's always been a divide in the Middle East, very obvious one, between the Gulf states and the Levant, culturally, linguistically, ethnically. The environment of the Gulf is also very different from the environment of the Levant. So the way that we dress, the way that we eat, there's a lot of differences. I mean, I have said this also as having lived in the Gulf. Like, a Syrian person will not be accepted as a local of the Gulf. So the divide is always there, and yet I think going forward, Syrian people need to recognize that the Levant is different, that we have to maintain our own identity and not adopt so much the identity that Al Jazeera was promoting before 2011, which was Wahhabism. So we need to make those lines clear. At the same time, I do think that a better Middle East would be one where people are friendly to each other and it's not divided, and there is that alliance. So that's what I do hope to see that in the future. It might involve a change of guard in the Gulf, like a change of leadership.
Yeah. There's a lot of potential power swings there in the future. We'll see. We'll see. Certainly, Saudi Arabia running the point position with regards to the Gulf. There's a lot of problems there with that situation. That it's difficult to say. But lastly, I want to get your also opinion on this. So right now, the economy. I know the U.S. is really strangling is doing their part with the EU in strangling Syria's economy through sanctions. And I have no idea what the basis of these sanctions are, from the Hula massacre, or on what basis they laid these sanctions down at various points from, like, say, 2012 or 2011 till now. The U.S. is also it appears to be squatting Syria's natural resources. So the embargo situation, you can't buy or sell to Syria. So they're having problems and shortages and scarcity on things that they shouldn't have any problems with normally. And currency inflation problems, systemic problems, the sort of things that happen when you're under embargo, basically, when you're under sanctions. And so, is there? Do you think there's any way? I mean, to break this sanctions deadlock, or do you think the U.S. will just and the EU will just leave sanctions on for an indefinite period of time? Because I know this isn't often talked about. The economic warfare side, the military side, of course, gets a lot of coverage, but I think it's kind of important. Because I think the U.S. strategy might be to choke off the economy to try to create another uprising in 5 or 6 years, or
that's the Iraq War scenario. Because after the Gulf War, there was, of course, the sanctions and the oil for food program and Chapter 7 resolution, and this whole Saddam didn't really disarm, so we'll have an excuse to go in later. Like, they're just trying to apply the Iraq scenario on Syria. And occupying Syria's oil fields is very brazenly, Trump and Lindsey Graham pointed out, like, this is in order to deny Assad or Syria their own resources so that they can't have it, we'll just sit in it. And also that's in order to protect Israel. So that is the strategy that they're playing, and there is a fuel shortage in Syria at the moment. Iran tries to break it by bringing in oil tankers, and their tankers get stopped in the Mediterranean Sea, and they get bombed off the coast of Saudi Arabia while taking that oil to Syria. And the embargo is making it, again, more difficult. So this is about choking off Syrian people. Maybe for the long term, just as that woman, what's her name? I forget, but she said, 500,000 kids was worth it. Like, the death of 500,000 children under the age of 5 due to the sanctions on Iraq was worth it for her if it weakens Saddam Hussein. So there is the potential of that, but Syria is not without friends. It's not an isolated country. It has Russia, Iran, China. It can create a sphere of economic growth outside of Europe and the US. It also has the principle of self-sufficiency, which has really helped allow Syria to survive the war, because those factories that were looted in Aleppo were producing stuff that usually the US buys stuff that are made in China, glasses, electronics, etc. Those kind of things were made in Syria, in Aleppo, which was targeted. These things were targeted as well. And the pharmaceutical industry. Syria was almost 98% self-sufficient in pharmaceuticals before the war began, and the pharmaceuticals industry was also targeted. But Syrians are very good at fixing things up and rebuilding, even if it's makeshift. They'll do it. So I see them bouncing back from that, and applying the principle of self-sufficiency is going to help resist those sanctions. Of course, Syria will need the use of its own oil in order to be able to be independent. But there are some things that Syria can't really make on its own. There are anti-cancer drugs that the pharmaceutical companies in the West have a patent on, which the Syrians don't have the formula for, so they can't reverse engineer them. And so there are kids with leukemia that are unable to get those drugs because of those sanctions. At the same time, the Boeing is sanctioning Syria, so Syria can't get replacement parts for certain aircrafts, which that means that Syria can't have a functioning airline, which is also dangerous. So there are certain things that it's going to take a while to fix, but I don't think that the Europe might, or the West and the US as well, might think that they can apply the Iraq scenario to Syria, and the sanctions, long-term sanctions, is going to defeat the country, but it won't. It's only going to make them unable to influence Syria at all.
Right. So they're basically, and this is kind of happening with Iran, isn't it? With U.S.-led sanctions on Iran, it's actually cleansing the country of any U.S. business ties, dollar deals, and it's forcing Iran to create other alternative economies, other alternative business arrangements, and with that leaves all U.S. influence, basically, all dollar influence, business influence, and
it's still good to resist these, to mount a political defense and try to remove these sanctions here in the West, but I doubt we will be successful. I mean, how many children died in Iraq and the sanctions remained?
Yeah, I think. I mean, you're sort of in the West, quote, so to speak, at the moment. I mean, is it because people in the West don't view sanctions as kind of, they don't really view them as harmful because they've never had to experience them? Why are people so ambivalent towards this idea of sanctions?
I think they're just kept in the dark. I mean, I don't think they even know that there's sanctions. If they knew that there's sanctions, they don't really understand what sanctions really mean for normal people. And even if they were able to realize that, then they're powerless to do anything about it.
Yeah, this is a big problem. I think is that overcoming that. That recognizing that the economic warfare is devastating, is equally as devastating as military warfare in some cases, and the effect it has on a country. But and so, I mean,
it's just a siege. It's basically a giant siege, like the Stalingrad siege, but over the whole country.
So how do you feel now, stepping back? This war has been going on. A war on your country has been going on since well, it's been going on a long time, but let's say this last phase since 2011, and now it's 2019. It's been 8 years. It's a long time. And how do you see your country today compared to where it was 8 years ago? Do you see how do you see have things changed in terms of has it changed the national character? Is it changed the destiny of the country going forward? This experience, what's happened to the country? How do you see? How do you see it?
By 8 years ago, do you mean to compare it to the start of the conflict or before the conflict?
Before the conflict and the start, but yeah, you could say before. Has this transformed the country in any fundamental way, or its attitude, or how it sees itself? Or
when I was there before the war began, I was already very, very politically aware about the Iraq War. I was an activist against the Iraq War. And what I felt was that there was this, I thought was like a naivety, or, when you don't know that there's a danger right next to you, you're kind of oblivious to a danger that was very obvious to me. For example, some of the old bomb shelters that were used during the war with Israel were being turned into underground bars. The Syrian school uniform used to be a military uniform, and learning sport, like the children, instead of having sport, they would learn how to fight. It would be military training, and there was a focus on the countries under threat. And I found that there was a lot of relaxation of that. The school uniform was changed into a business uniform. And for Syrians, they probably thought, oh, this is great. Like, things are changing for the better. We're modernizing. But for someone like me, I felt really uncomfortable, and I thought that it was dangerous. But I think now, people really must know that the danger is still there. And maybe there's a more of a national focus on getting rid of that danger. And when I say that, I'm 100% talking about the danger from Israel, because this entire thing, including the support for Al-Qaeda, couldn't have happened without them, masterminding the whole situation due to the Zionist lobby influencing the United States. AIPAC has been backing this thing the whole time. Lindsey Graham is an example of that. So I think that people now won't forget the resistance, but luckily it didn't change the national character in the way that the US wanted to change it. It didn't become a sectarian government. It didn't split up the country, federalizing the Alawite coast and the Druze south and the Kurdish east. That hasn't happened. And therefore I see hope for Syria's future.
So you think that people still have that feeling when they see the flag flying, that uniting, like different people uniting behind the flag as Syrians, that's still as strong as it was before, or stronger? Maybe
even stronger, I would say, especially like amongst those that still fly that flag. Unfortunately, not for those that do not fly that flag. Whether they fly the flag of the SDF or the PKK or the FSA and the 3-star flag. Like, for those people, yeah, there is a clear division from the Syrian identity. But for those people that do fly that flag, which I am one, I see more of a cohesiveness and a unity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Something to look forward to. Certainly, that's unique in the Middle East. It's definitely unique in the Middle East, and that's maybe something to be hopeful for going forward. But I think we're out of time for this segment, Mimi. But I want to thank you so much for joining us this week on the Sunday Wire.
My pleasure. I love reading your newspaper, and I hope people do check it out because it's got excellent stuff on there. So thank you so much for having me on. It's been an honor.
Thank you. Maram Susli, a.k.a. Syrian Girl, a.k.a. Partisan Girl. There's a link to her Twitter account right now on the show page. And also check out her work. Certainly right now, it's very, very informative and timely. Do follow her social media feeds, everybody. But thank you so much again for joining us. We're going to take a short break, and we're going to connect our next guest. We're going to Asia after this break, and we're going to connect with Andrei Vilcek, the intrepid investigative journalist and global affairs commentator. This is the Sunday Wire. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. This is the 300th episode of this weekly omnibus news and analysis radio program here on ACR. Stick around. We'll be right back after this station break.
Your shadow fell upon my